This is the 61st edition of the Statistical Review. Started out as an internal document to just collect information which at the time wasn't available even for companies working in energy on production, consumption, reserves. And still is around because still these markets are not transparent enough and there is a lack of information, which we try to provide by making these numbers available in public. And I think when you now look at magazines, newspapers, and so people do quote these numbers and use them, it indicates that even in the year 2012, there still is a need for collecting these numbers country by country, fuel by fuel, carefully and diligent, scrubbing each of them, and trying to make them publicly available. When you think back at 2011, it was a year which had quite some disruptions. There was Fukushima, the terrible accident, the earthquake and the tsunami, knocking out nuclear power and coal power to some extent in Japan, having knock-on effects in countries like Germany, who decided to back away from nuclear. And there was what came to be known as the Arab Spring, from political unrest and upheaval in the region all the way to the war in Libya. And that, of course, knocked out some of the oil supply, in particular for Europe. And yet, when you look, and this is interesting, when you look at the aggregate numbers in economic growth and in energy production and consumption globally, it looks almost boring. It looks as if nothing has happened. So what we are asking this year is, how did the system cope? And how was it possible to sort of overcome these pretty heavy disturbances without leaving much trace in the aggregate picture? And it turns out that, of course, the system was busy reconfiguring itself and readjusting to these shocks. You can see that when you look at prices. Last year, we had on average the highest oil price ever in nominal terms, $111 per barrel of Brent. Never in the history of oil markets has the nominal price been above $100. Now it was $111. And if you want to adjust for inflation, you still have to go back all the way to 1864 to find a higher oil price than what we had last year. Gas prices in the US were low because of shale gas, but in the rest of the world they were high because they're indexed to oil prices, and coal prices also rose. So these increase in prices give a first indication that not everything was as normal as the sort of boring averages suggest. And what happened behind this quite average numbers is a story which comes in three parts. The first thing in terms of adjustment, what happened was there was a massive increase in crude oil production by OPEC. Mostly by Saudi Arabia. It kicked in a little bit late, but for the year as a whole it was perfectly sufficient to compensate for the Libyan outages and also to satisfy increased oil demand in the world. To that you have to add a reconfiguration of trade so that Libyan outages in Europe were replaced with crude from Africa, with crude from Saudi Arabia, and a very flexible European refining capacity which also had excess capacity, which had no problem of converting this heavier crude slate from Saudi Arabia, for example, and refining those products which used to refine from the lighter crude coming from Libya. So that's the first one, an increase in production, flexible refining and trading system in oil. The second one is that we have seen a decline in gas consumption, natural gas consumption in Europe, after a very large increase in 2010. And what happened here was that LNG, liquefied natural gas, came to be diverted from Europe into Asia. And the reason, of course, is that the nuclear outages in Japan had to be replaced with something, and it was replaced with natural gas. In addition, in Asia, you have very strong demand for gas anyway, from India, China, all these fast-growing economies. And that had to be satisfied as well. So Asia attracted a lot more natural gas as a consequence of the Fukushima disaster, and that gas was missing in Europe. And the third part was that, for some part, how this gas in Europe, the missing gas, was replaced. Partially by reasons which were not so positive, because demand was low in Europe, because the economy was weak, partially because Europe had a big swing in the weather and a very warm winter, so it didn't need as much energy. But partially that missing gas was replaced by an increase in coal consumption in Europe. Where did that coal come from? That coal came from across the Atlantic, from Colombia and from the US. How was it possible that all of a sudden so much coal became available in these countries? In the case of the US, interestingly, that was possible because of shale gas in the US. The US, as you know, had this large breakthrough in producing shale gas and have a lot of gas with cheap prices. That gas is not yet ready to be exported, but it is ready to back out coal from power generation in the US. So coal becomes available for export elsewhere, and that coal came to Europe and facilitated this transition by making Europe less dependent on gas and making it possible for this gas to go into Asia to replace the outages from Fukushima. What last year proved again, I think, is that the more interdependent the energy system is allowed to be, the more integrated markets are, the more people are allowed to trade, the safer countries are. And you see that when you see how smooth Japan managed to replace the outages of nuclear energy with gas from elsewhere, with oil from elsewhere. And you see that how little Europe suffered, either at the pump or anywhere else, from the outages from Libya. Just think, for the sake of argument for a minute, if Japan would have been energy independent, in the sense that they wouldn't have been integrated in a global system, but would have relied only on their own resources. But because the economy and its energy system are globally integrated, are flexible, they could rely on a diversity of different supplies and minimize the impacts of this true disaster, after all. And the second big lesson, I think, is the importance of allowing free access to investments in energy. We have seen last year the continuation of something which started already around 2005 in North America, and that's the development of new unconventional fuels. In the oil area, this is now shale oil, which is generated with the very technology which has been developed in order to give us shale gas. It's heavy oil from Canada, and it is deep water. And it is no accident that all these technologies have been developed in North America, in particular in the US and in Canada. Why it is no accident? Because there is an investment regime which allows for open access and for competition. And it's this competition of firms against firms which breeds innovation and creates these technologies, which now made it possible that the US increasingly every year produces more of its own oil again and reduces its import dependency. This has the potential in the long term to have huge, even geopolitical impacts. What we've seen last year with respect to carbon emissions and the relationship between energy and the environment actually has a big lesson which can be learned there. There is bad news and there's good news. The bad news, unfortunately, is bigger than the good news, so to speak. The bad news is that last year, again, coal was the fastest growing fuel. And therefore, carbon emissions, again, will have continued to rise substantially. There is, however, one region in the world where this was different. And it's, of all the regions in the world, it's none of those where you have carbon prices, big environmental desires or designs on part of governments or any of that. It is the US. In the US, carbon emissions actually slow down. And the reason for this is the replacement of coal in power generation by abundant natural gas. There always are these discussions and viewpoints and people who are worried about us running out of energy, about peak oil, about peak gas, about God knows what. And 200 years ago, they were worried about peak coal. What we do, one of the things we do in the statistical review is we collect data on reserves, on proved reserves. We do use the numbers given to us by governments, so this is a big basket, sometimes good apples, sometimes bad apples, but I hope that the law of large numbers applies and they average out. And what they show us that since we started this in 1980, year after year after year, reserves tend to increase despite more and more energy being produced year after year. We have now, I think, about 54 years of proved oil reserves left, more than 60 years of proved gas reserves left. And this is not a number which is static, but it continues to go up as prices rise, as new technologies become developed, and as new discoveries are made. Nothing in these numbers indicates that we are running out of hydrocarbons.